Hello hockey fans, Oddman Rush here and welcome back to another video. Apologies if I sound a little rough this weekend, but I've been dealing with an illness for the last 3 or 4 days now and my voice has been absolutely shot throughout. I should be alright to record this, but let's just see how it goes, shall we? It's All-Star Weekend in the National Hockey League, and some of the best players during the first half of the 22-23 season have come together in sunny Florida to take part in both the skills competition and the various games over the weekend as part of their respective divisions. Now, the All-Star Game and All-Star Weekend in general is certainly a debated topic within the NHL and the hockey community, as you have some people on one side that say it's not a fun event to watch, they usually skip it, it's really not for them, and it doesn't really add anything, whereas you have people on the other side that say it's a really fun weekend where you get to forget about the regular season standings and all the different scores taking place, and you get to see these hockey players actually have a bit of fun and not be so robotic as they usually are during the season. So I asked you guys to tell me what your thoughts were on the NHL All-Star Game and NHL All-Star Weekend in its current format, and I asked you to tell me why. So you guys sent me a bunch of different ideas, a bunch of different thoughts and opinions on it, and I think you guys had some really interesting things to say, so I thought it could be fun in this video to kind of sit down and take a look through them and maybe give my thoughts to your opinions and your thoughts as well as provide my own thoughts on the All-Star Game towards the end of the video. So let's just get into it, shall we? First up, we have a comment from Feline Storm who says, either scrap the fan vote or actually let fans vote anyone in. I think this is really interesting actually because the fan vote came in, John Scott was voted to the All-Star Game, and to be honest, I think that was the last All-Star Game that I actually watched because, you know, a guy like John Scott that doesn't really have any business being at an All-Star Game where the best of the best players are playing, he obviously gets crowned All-Star MVP. It's a great story. The NHL essentially tried to block him from going to the game altogether, but it's such a feel-good story. It was such a wonderful moment in NHL history. But unfortunately, the NHL realized they didn't want players like that taking part in the event, so they took specific steps to make sure you could only vote for specific players on certain teams, which obviously means that you're only voting for a handful of players from every team to try and get them into the All-Star Game, which eliminates the possibility of a real feel-good story or a meme option, I guess. Obviously, I don't think any player would want to end up going to the All-Star Game every year as a bit of a joke. I don't think they'd enjoy that, unless they've got a good sense of humour. I'm sure there are plenty of players around the National Hockey League that if they were voted in as kind of the joke candidate, some of them would take it very well and on the chin and would have a good laugh about it, but I feel like some other players might get quite offended or upset by that because, you know, they want to be voted in by the merits on the ice and not because some jokester on social media decided to start a movement to get them voted in. And also at the same time, the whole John Scott situation, it's great because it was a rare thing that happened once. If that happened every single year, I don't think it would be nearly as exciting, nearly as heartwarming, nearly as fun, to be honest, if there was this kind of joke candidate or meme candidate voted in every single All-Star Game. It would lose a lot of the humour behind it, a lot of the fun behind it. So you don't really want to see an enforcer or a tough guy that doesn't put up many points, plays 5 minutes a night getting into the All-Star Game unless they're a really big personality in the league. Obviously, there could be something said about if they're a big personality maybe voting them in because, you know, it's the All-Stars and they're an all-star character within the NHL. I think you could make an argument there, but I do kind of agree with this, that maybe just let everybody vote for whoever they want. And then if the NHL doesn't like it and fans end up hating it because we get this meme person voted in every single year, then the NHL will go back and say, well guys, we tried to tell you it was a silly idea, but you guys wanted it, so give the people what they want in that sense, and then let them decide that they don't necessarily enjoy that every year or it's not a good idea. But yeah, the whole like voting for 4 or 5 different players on every single team, I understand why the NHL's doing it based on previous events, but at the same time it really does boil down the amount of players that you can pick and does take out a lot of the personality in it because you're only picking the top point scorers from every team, which, yes, obviously they should be the ones at the All-Star Game because they're the best players so far midway through that regular season, but at the same time, the All-Star Game's meant to be fun, it's meant to be exciting. Yes, these players can make it fun and exciting, but it needs more personality. And the problem is, a lot of the players that go to the All-Star Game, these top players that have been media trained since they were in diapers pretty much, they don't really have much personality, or they don't show it very well in front of cameras and everything. So yeah, maybe go back to letting anybody be voted in for the All-Star game. I think it could be fun, but then again, like I said, after a few seasons, that could become really stale really quickly. So that's a difficult one. I don't really know what to suggest then. Do we go back to it or do we not? I think maybe once more we should go back to it and see how it goes. And if the John Scott situation happens again, maybe we should find a different way. But the way in which the voting is done doesn't really excite anybody or most hockey fans, at least in my opinion. So that's kind of how I feel on that. I don't know if I'm in the minority here, but there you go. Next up, we have Craig Baird on Twitter, who says, I prefer the classic All-Star Game format of the 80s and before. That being said, I understand that the All-Star Game is kind of geared towards kids now, and they want to make it as interesting as possible for them. I don't typically watch it, but I think it's essentially fine. Now, I will preface this by saying that I never really watched any of the All-Star Games of the 1980s. I was a mid-90s kid, and I didn't really get into the NHL until about 2010, 2011, so that was way past my time personally, so I can't really speak to the whole 1980s format. Obviously, I've seen clips of it, you know, Gordie Howe, Wayne Gretzky, Mike Gartner, Mark Messier, those kind of league legends and superstars taking part in the events. And obviously, I could understand why those would be looked at more fondly, because we look back on a lot of the players in those events as the best players in the game. Obviously, they had the hardest shot competition stuff, and they were using more wooden sticks than the kind of composite sticks that they use nowadays. The skating and the technology and the equipment that they use is obviously far more refined than it was, say, 30, 40 years ago. But I think that Craig makes a really good point here that the All-Star Game is very much an event that if you watch it in person, it's probably a lot of fun. And for kids and young adult fans of the NHL, I can imagine it being a lot of fun. I think it's more as you get older and you realize that, first of all, nothing that happens there really matters in the grand scheme of things, which isn't a problem in and of itself, but at the same time, it kind of takes away any of the stakes within the competition, and it kind of, yes, it's a fun event and it's kind of chilled and laid back, but you kind of need something exciting to draw people in, and every single year there doesn't really seem to be anything that's that fun or exciting or a reason for somebody to stop what they're doing to specifically go and watch the All-Star Game. But yeah, I definitely agree that the event is geared more towards the live crowd and the kids and young adults and teenagers that watch the NHL that either idolize specific players or love specific players of specific teams. That makes a lot of sense. I could certainly understand that. And I do like the fact that for the skills competition this year, they did use their reverse retro jerseys for every single team. It was a really nice touch, and that subtle little detail that I think will be appreciated when looking back on this event. I will say that I didn't watch the skills competition. I'd been working all day, and obviously I'm sick, so I wasn't really in the mood to stay up till like 3:30 in the morning to watch it all. But yeah, Craig, I think you're onto something here, bud. I think this is very much geared towards a younger audience to try and get more young people and more young fans into the game and more interested, and kind of trying to make those players out to be superstars. The problem is the NHL doesn't do a very good job of marketing its superstars. It's nowhere near the levels of the NBA, for example, where you will have people who are fans of specific players and they will follow wherever that player goes and support the team that they play for in that moment. You don't really have that in the NHL, and I don't think the NHL does a very good job of branching out to its younger audience and really engaging them into the sport by doing any of these viral things, by doing any of these new things. And when they do, it just comes across as really cringe and disingenuous and really kind of embarrassing. So yeah, I definitely think the All-Star Game is geared more towards kids and a younger audience, and I can understand why you would be more interested in the older All-Star Games. Me personally, I did not watch the All-Star Game, and I'm not watching any of the All-Star events this year, and I don't think I'm that worse off for it, you know? Moving on to Alex Silva, who says, hot take, bring back the draft format. Best player in each conference is named captain, and they pick from any all-star selected. I think this is a really interesting concept that the NHL should potentially consider revisiting. Obviously, during the mid-2010s and the early 2000s, the NHL did use the captain format and the all-star draft format. The one I remember specifically was Team Nicholas Lidstrom versus Team Eric Stahl, and they had a draft take place where they picked from all the different all-stars. Didn't matter whether you were from the Western Conference or the Eastern Conference. Each of the captains got to pick their respective players. There was always a bit of a joke over who was the last player selected, and there'd always be a bit of a laugh, and obviously a lot of these players know each other, so there was a lot of inside jokes, a lot of laughs, and then those players would compete for their respective teams at the skills competition and during the All-Star Game. I think that's more of a fun idea. Imagine Team Connor McDavid versus Team David Pasternak, and both of them get to pick throughout all the All-Stars to make their team. I think that could be a lot of fun for the players themselves. I think it adds a lot more personality, because you could really play up the draft event, not drag it out like the NHL does with a lot of their other events, but maybe go into why certain players are selecting these other players and why the captains have chosen to pick these players. Make it fun, make it exciting, maybe do a bit of stand-up with it, make it more of an event where it's light-hearted, it's fun. Obviously, a lot of these players are very robotic when they respond and when they interact with the media, and potentially with each other when the cameras are rolling. And understandably so for the most part. They don't want to make any mistakes or trip up or make themselves known for all the wrong reasons, right? But at the same time, I think it would be really fun if you had maybe a stand-up comedian or something hosting the event, so they can really play off the players and make sure the players are comfortable and take part and really give in to the whole, like, fun laughter side of it, as opposed to just that we're here to play the events and do it by the book, and yeah, we can have a couple of smiles along the way, but it's still taken relatively seriously. Because let's be honest, all of these players are pretty much going out drinking and celebrating and chilling out for the days before the All-Star game and the skills competition, so they're not taking the whole weekend that seriously. They're taking it as a chance to blow off some steam while still doing NHL related stuff and work related stuff, so why not let them enjoy it a little bit more? The NHL is so starved of personality. I think if we can get people like stand-up comedians and comedy people and really solid presenters that know how to deal with comedy and things like that, I think it could make for a much more fun experience, especially if we did a draft or the skills competition. Somebody like PK Subban, getting him into like a real role there could actually be a really good idea, because he's really embraced that whole on-air personality, and obviously he's only been in it for a short time, but you can tell that he's got real potential there. So get PK Subban in charge of running a draft, guys. It would be a lot of fun. Penultimately, we have Let's Talk Knights on Twitter, who says, it's very good in giving the players a personality. You can see the fun side of them, but also see what their game is all about. So for newcomers, it's brilliant. I think this is a really good point, actually. The fact that the All-Star game, like we've mentioned earlier, it gives players the chance to wind down a little bit and kind of relax, not have to think about the regular season standings, their individual point totals. They know they've been selected to the All-Star game, either because they're one of the best players across the entire league so far that season, or they're the best player on their team so far that season, or the fans love them so much that they voted them in. So they know that they're wanted to be there, they know that they're going to have fun, they know there's going to be a lot of spectacle, a lot of excitement, and even the more kind of introverted players, if they don't want to be in the spotlight and the center of attention, they can kind of fade into the background a little bit and just chill with some of the players, especially during the skills competition and in the locker rooms. They can just kind of enjoy the company, because let's be honest, nobody understands what being an NHL player full-time, a professional hockey player in the National Hockey League is like, except the other players in those locker rooms at that time. So, and especially if you're interacting with players at the same level as you as well. Obviously you can interact with players on your respective team locker room, but sometimes it might be nice to talk to a Vezina winning goaltender and see like, oh, what was the difference between winning the Vezina and not? Like, what changes did you make in the off-season to help that out? Or how did you go from scoring 20 goals a season to 40 goals a season and becoming a superstar, you know? Maybe those conversations are being had, maybe they're not, and the guys are just chilling and talking about what they want to eat for dinner that night, you know? But I think Knights makes a really good point here that there's a lot more personality injected into the All-Star game. Obviously, when you're watching it on the TV, it's difficult to kind of discern a lot of that. I would imagine seeing it in person is a lot better for that, but I think, like Knight said as well, you get to see their personality as well as the type of player they are, whether they're an accurate shooter like Connor McDavid absolutely scorching the accuracy competition, Elias Pettersson, hardest shot over 100 miles an hour, you know, the fastest skater competition. You can have a really clear idea on who you think is going to win it, and then maybe a lesser known star in the game scorches everybody because they have a really good lap, and suddenly they're crowned the fastest skater, and you go, hang on a second, that guy's a lot faster than I thought they were. Maybe they are one of the fastest skaters in the NHL. So you get to learn a little bit more about each individual player, and I think it gives them a chance to maybe show off more than necessarily they might do. Obviously, if they play in a smaller market, they might not necessarily get as much attention as some of the other stars at the All-Star game do, and it gives them a chance to kind of throw themselves into the spotlight and go, hey, look at me, guys, I'm also a solid player as well. Yes, I've been invited to the All-Star game, but I'm also a star amongst the stars. So yeah, I do agree that for all the faults that the All-Star game has, it does give players a little bit more of an opportunity to show off their personalities and also show off what their game is like, and maybe some lesser known elements of their game that not many people will really know them for, and kind of surprise everyone and show them that they might have been underrating them in some aspects a little bit. But I think that the All-Star game needs to push a lot more towards the personality side of things. They're kind of getting there, but I think they need to go a lot further. Obviously, it's very easy for me to sit here and say, they need to do this, they need to do that, but not actually provide any alternatives or any reasons for them to do this or how to go about doing that. But I'm also not a multi-millionaire who's paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to work in the NHL's front office and organise all of these events. So unless you guys want to give me a job, NHL, you guys need to figure this out on your own, okay? And finally, we have D. Tompkins11, who says, All-Stars should be selected after a full season of play and not halfway through the season. Now, while I understand the thought process here, unfortunately the problem arises when you take into account the Stanley Cup playoffs. Obviously, you would want All-Stars selected to the event that have not been a half-season wonder or had a couple of really good weeks towards the end of December and early January. You want players that have been consistent throughout the entire regular season, but unfortunately, if you put the All-Star game after the regular season and before the playoffs, I really feel like players are going to be even less interested and less invested in it than they already are right now. And let's be honest, they're not really that invested to begin with when it takes place in January or February, right? I think if you put the All-Star game after the regular season and before the Stanley Cup playoffs, another big issue that would arise is the fact that a lot of the players taking part in the All-Star game would be getting ready to play in the playoffs, whether it be a week or even 2 weeks later after that. So you've got players that are so invested in trying to get themselves in the best condition, trying to heal up, get themselves in a position where they can compete for the Stanley Cup and maybe take home the championship that could make or break their career. But on the flip side, they're being asked to go to Florida for a week and take part in a couple of events over a weekend that they don't really care about. I don't think that really matches up. I understand that, yes, you want to have players that have shown that they're great all season long, but also you've got to think of it that if the All-Star game takes place and a week later the Stanley Cup playoffs take place, what if a player gets injured during the All-Star break, which has happened before on numerous occasions? Then obviously the fan base of that player are going to be like, oh, well, they shouldn't have held the All-Star game, then our player would have been here, maybe we would have got past the first round or made it to the conference finals, maybe even won the cup if our star player was still there. And also on the flip side, if you have a couple of players that enjoy All-Star weekend a little too much and maybe party a little too much or are a little bit too relaxed, they don't really go into the playoffs too focused or too serious about their job, then the fan base and the local media are going to get straight on them and be like, they had the All-Star blues or whatever, or it's the All-Star curse. So I feel like it's a lose-lose situation. Maybe after the playoffs could be a discussion point there, but at the same time, most of the teams around the NHL have stopped playing roughly a month before that, because obviously once you get to the Cup finals, there's only 2 teams left out of 32 teams. So you've got players that are back home in their respective native countries. They're going on vacation. They're spending time with their family. They don't want to be dragged out 6 weeks after the regular season ends, or even 2 months after the regular season ends, to take part in a weekend that means absolutely nothing, especially when a lot of these players might have contracts that are expiring a week or 2 later, and they're either going to be staying with the team that they signed with or have been with before that season and during that season, or they're going to be signing with a completely new organisation. And how does that work? We've seen with Bo Horvat being traded to the Islanders and having to wear the Islanders jersey, even though he's representing the Vancouver Canucks at the All-Star game. It's an absolute mess, and it really doesn't make any sense there. It doesn't really seem to be a right or wrong answer there. So why would we want to do that with a dozen different players as their contracts expire as well? I see where you're going with this, Tompkins, but I think holding the All-Star game either before the playoffs or after the playoffs would be an absolute logistical nightmare. The players wouldn't be invested in it, even less so than they already are right now. You wouldn't know where half the players are going to be playing the week after that. And yes, it would be a nice kind of storybook ending to each regular season, but a lot of players are either celebrating with the Stanley Cup and don't care about next season until next season actually starts, or they're off making memories with their families that they can't do during the regular season. So it just doesn't make any sense logistically. Now, in terms of how I feel about the All-Star game, I've already alluded to some of my opinions in some of the prior responses, but I'll be perfectly honest, I don't think I've watched both a skills competition and the All-Star game since 2015, 2016, when John Scott was named the MVP and when he took part, which I think was 2015 or 16. So it's been about 6 or 7 years now since I've sat down and actually really enjoyed the entirety of All-Star Weekend. Don't get me wrong, there are some times where I'll sit there and watch the skills competition, because I'll be honest, the skills competition is a lot more fun to watch than the All-Star games. But even still, I don't think I've really watched them the last 2 years. Obviously, the pandemic cut short the All-Star games before that, so it could well have been about half a decade since I've last watched a skills competition as well. I just don't really find it that interesting. Yes, the All-Star game does bring out the players' personalities a little bit more, but I still find they're so robotic and they're so afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing for fear of something happening on hockey social media, especially hockey Twitter, and them kind of being lambasted for it and kind of criticised for it. So I understand why the players are doing what they're doing, but as a result, it means that it's not fun to watch and it's really boring. But that being said, maybe that's because the event isn't made for me. Don't get me wrong, I'm obviously a hardcore hockey fan who makes hockey videos, so you'd think, well, surely you're the target audience for this. You're a hardcore fan who knows a lot of these players, you're following their careers, you're following their seasons, surely you should be the perfect person to enjoy this stuff. But maybe it's because, like Craig said, that it's more to do with getting a younger audience invested, getting newer fans into seats around arenas. Maybe it's for kids and young adults and young fans to really get to know these players a little bit more and see the best of the best on one of the biggest stages during the NHL's calendar every year, and they get to kind of fall in love with the players, they fall in love with the kind of theatrics of it, and they fall in love with the speed and the style and the skill of all of these players. So maybe I'm not the target audience, and maybe that's okay. You know? Yes, the All-Star game, in my opinion, needs a lot of improvement and it's nowhere near reaching the potential that it potentially could be. At the same time, maybe I'm just not the target audience for this, and maybe I'm more interested in the regular season meaning something and those day-to-day battles and those rivalries between these long-standing teams that take place as opposed to the players themselves. I love looking at interesting stories from players and teams and hockey history, but the players themselves and their personalities I'm not hugely interested in, I'll be honest. So maybe it's a me thing. I don't know. Maybe I'm the reason I don't enjoy the All-Star game. Maybe the NHL's at fault because the All-Star game sucks, but maybe I'm trying to find something in it that isn't there. So, yeah, the All-Star game's kind of interesting. I don't really watch it, but if you enjoy it, that's great too, right? Now, I would have loved to have gone through a few more responses, but as you can probably tell, my voice is really giving out right now. So on that note, I'm going to end today's video here, guys. That was a little discussion about the NHL All-Star game and your thoughts and my thoughts on NHL All-Star Weekend and whether you think it's good or not. What do you guys think about the NHL All-Star Game and NHL All-Star Weekend? Do you think it's a great event that you really enjoy to watch? Is it something that you haven't watched for a while and think it needs improvement? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Did you agree with my thoughts? Did you disagree? Do we find somewhere in the middle where we can meet? Once again, like I always say, we do not have to agree with this kind of stuff. You're more than welcome to disagree with me. That's what makes these videos fun. But thanks for watching, guys. I do hope you have enjoyed. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, watch some of my other videos. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye. A big thank you to Bexy93, Burned Retinas, Drew Forsid, Houston NG, Raquel, and Worthless Pieces for helping support this video via Patreon. If you too want to help support the channel a little bit further and get a shout out at the end of every future video, make sure you head over to patreon.com/oddmanrush and become a patron today.